sent out a mayday call. Coast Guard say conditions at the time were horrendous. Rescue teams have worked through the night, but this morning they found a second life raft empty and uninflated.
The President, for us as the 7 fishermen whose lives were lost, the Irish Sea can be a provider and a defender. It can be a source of wild beauty, but it can also be a cruel predator, and it was a predator that it struck last Tuesday.
Most of us will have crossed the Irish Sea when conditions are not ideal. A few will have stories to tell of really frightening crossings, some of which have lasted many hours when landfall was impractical. Being relatively shallow, the Irish Sea can produce colossal waves relatively quickly, but the ships and boats that can be found upon this boisterous stretch of water are in the main designed for the conditions they could meet. Those that are not stay in port. But the Irish Sea fisherman relies on his catch to support himself or herself or their families, and will put out to sea confident in the ability of their vessel to ride out all but the very worst conditions. But occasionally, circumstances tip the balance and render a vessel unable to withstand what nature is throwing at it. That was the case in Millennium Year 2000 on January the 11th, a Tuesday. It's the story of loss and the despair of a small Scottish community, and how another community reached out its hand to offer comfort and support as best it could. It's the story of the Solway Harvester. I arrived at Manx Radio to do the early morning news shift. That was some time before 6 a.m. At my desk, I looked out generally across Douglas Bay and the Irish Sea, but being January, it was pitch black outside. But having fought my way from my car to the front door, I was aware that what we on the island would call a hoolie was in progress. I checked the news sources and those news stories that had been left for me by the newsreader from the previous evening. There was a note at the bottom which read, "There seems to be a fishing boat in difficulty off the east coast. Best check on it later this morning." Moments later, the seriousness of the situation became very evident as the UK media started bombarding our newsroom for more information. By the time our first scheduled bulletin went on air at 7, we had spoken with and recorded a number of interviews with the emergency services, both on the island and with services on the Mersey and in Ireland. This programme is very much about the aftermath of the disaster. But how did it happen in a vessel that was designed to ride out such conditions? In the report of the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, the preface says the Solway Harvester sailed from Cancubri at about 1:30 on the 10th of January and headed south into the Irish Sea. 7 people were on board. At 9:30 on Tuesday the 11th, the skipper had already filled 150 to 155 bags of scallops. The wind at the time was light, force 2, but the forecast was bad. Solway Harvester hauled her gear at 3:30. The conditions were deteriorating. With the wind now southwest, force 7 to 8, and the forecast continuing poor, the skipper headed for shelter at Ramsey Bay in the Isle of Man, about 27 miles to the northwest. The last communication from Solway Harvester was to another skipper who was at home. The weather conditions were poor, and Manx Radio was forecasting winds of up to 50 knots. The call was transmitted at 5:29.
The search last night was ended on our behalf at about 01:30 and was resumed at first light. From first light we've had Douglas and Ramsey Coast Guard teams searching the coastline. That's search will continue until darkness tonight.
The thoughts of the whole house are with the families of the 7 fishermen who are missing at sea off the Isle of Man. Our profound sympathy is with them all.
So that is known for certain. But what actually happened on board the Solway Harvester? Some of what follows is obviously conjecture after a close investigation of the wreck and the circumstances. I read again from the MAIB report. In theory, a vessel like Solway Harvester should have been able to cope comfortably with the seas that night. What the MAIB had to determine is what sequence of events could have caused the capsize of an inherently stable vessel. The following reconstruction is necessarily speculative to a degree, but has been proved feasible by exhaustive tests and trials and is, in the professional opinion of the MAIB, the only explanation that fits all the facts. Solway Harvester recovered her last catch at 3:30. If the crew had processed it immediately, the fish room would then have been unoccupied from 4:15, approximately 1.5 hours before she capsized. If the catch had not been processed immediately, but stored in the tipping bins, the fish room would have been unoccupied since 3:15. It appears that during this period, the fish room flooded through water draining off the main deck through the ice scuttles, which were kept open to facilitate the passage of chutes from picking trays on the deck. The bilge alarm was known to be defective, so gave no warning of the flooding. Solway Harvester's skipper finished the last of a series of calls on the vessel's mobile telephone and VHF radio at 5:29. He was in the wheelhouse, monitoring the vessel's passage to Ramsey Bay, some 12 miles away. At least 4 of the crew were in their bunks in the aft cabin, and one, possibly both, of the others were up and about elsewhere. A few minutes later, the skipper must have become aware that something was not right. Perhaps it was the vessel's subdued motion, or he noticed a list had developed, or he had been alerted to a problem by one of the crew. Whatever the prompt, he became suspicious that there was excessive water in the fish room. The mate was not on board this trip, and the skipper had nobody else on board with sufficient experience to sort out the flooding. He therefore decided to leave the wheelhouse himself. Before leaving it, he pulled the throttle gear lever back to the neutral position and moved the throttle lever to maintain the engine speed. This would normally ensure the bilge pump and generators continued to run to capacity. He turned off the autopilot to stop unnecessary rudder movement. As the way came off, Solway Harvester would have come beam to the sea, with the wind and waves on her port beam. She would have started to roll more heavily. It cannot be determined exactly what he did, the skipper, but 2 thoughts would have occurred to him. The need to alert the crew and to get the water pumped out quickly as possible. He would have wondered why the bilge pump, set to pump the fish room slush well continuously, was not working as it should. The skipper probably saw water being discharged over the side, but would have not been able to tell whether this included bilge water from the fish room. At some point the skipper was in the engine room. Possibly he used the foredeck hatch to get there. It was later found open. It is not known what he was trying to do in the engine room, but it is known that it involved taking local control of the engine's speed by lifting the governor control lever on the main engine and rotating it through 180 degrees. This was the position in which it was found. One of the fishermen was inside the fish room with a screwdriver and might well have been trying to clear the submerged bilge suction strainer. Solway Harvester would have rolled to a very large angle, probably 30 to 40 degrees. This would have caused some of the catch and the spare gear in the fish room to slide to starboard. Solway Harvester would have slowly recovered to a list of about 20 to 25 degrees. but been prevented from coming further upright by a number of factors. The movement of cargo and spare gear to starboard, the water trapped in the starboard passageway, and water retained on the main deck. Water would have continued to flood into the starboard passageway and the aft workshop through the open, weathertight doors. The starboard ice scuttle would have been submerged, causing massive additional flooding to the fish room and eroding the vessel's stability still further. The quantity of water retained on the main deck would have increased. Slowly to start with, but ever faster, the Solway Harvester would have rolled to starboard until she lay on her side. The crew would not have been able to do anything about it. She would have continued to roll until almost completely upside down. The flooding would have continued until all positive buoyancy had been destroyed. She sank at about 5:45. Nothing more was heard from her until 5:47, when a polar orbiting satellite detected signals from an emergency position indicating radio beacon. The people of the Isle of Man have for centuries harvested the seas around its coasts. Before tourism, farming and fishing were the Manx economy. At one stage, there were over 400 Manx fishing boats, nobbies and nickies crowding into harbours such as Peel.
Now you're up on deck, you're a fisherman. You can swear and show a manly bearing.
The herring was the key to the fishery, the silver darlings as they were named. When mass tourism arrived from the middle of the 1900s, the herring was smoked and the Manx kipper was ubiquitous on breakfast tables of boarding houses. The seas gave generously in those days, but it had a violent side to its nature. The generosity came at a cost. In 1787, the Manx herring fleet, making for the safety of Douglas Harbour in a gale, were caught out when a temporary marking light at the entrance to the harbour was swept away after a vessel collided with it. In the darkness of the storm, it made the entrance to the harbour all but invisible. 21 fishermen died in the resulting chaos. When the likelihood emerged that the Solway Harvester's crew had all perished, the island's government and its council of ministers decided to do what it could do to support the families in their grief. Chief Minister in year 2000 was Donald Gelling.
Over recent years of trawlers that have gone down outside our territory, that the families have had to gather round with their friends and other people who have made donations, and they have retrieved the bodies. Now, I think that gives certainly to me a signal that the families of fishermen do want their friends, family and husbands home. They don't want them left in the vessels, and I think this is a lead that we've taken, that we want to be able to assist in that operation.
£1 million was made available by the Manx as the vessel was first located, a difficult task, and then the bodies of the 7 were recovered.
Rescue teams have worked through the night, but this morning they found a second life raft empty and uninflated. And Liverpool Coast Guard Don MacDonald says they've now given up hope of finding the men alive.
We are now confident that if any member of the crew was visible at sea, we would have located him. All we can do now is try and locate the vessel by means of sonars and sounders to see if it's lying on the seabed. Hopefully today we will locate the vessel.
A dive team of 3 went off the salvage ship, the Well Servicer, about midday today, and remarkably, within about 2.5 hours, they had been able to locate the 4 crewmen who were still missing, as well as the 3 who'd been found previously, and bring them back up to the Well Servicer, and they were able to report to the families at 3:15 this afternoon that all their loved ones had been found.
What reaction, if any, from the families, do we know?
We do know at the media conference were 2 of their representatives, the Reverend Alex Curry, the Whithorn minister. He was with them when the news was broken, and he said there were many, many tears, his included, and there were tears of relief at the outcome, because one of the worst possible outcomes of this would have been that the families had come over here only to find that a certain number of their bodies, not all 7 of their loved ones, had been found. They've got the outcome they were praying for.
Well, when we heard the news this afternoon, there were obviously many tears, myself included. These tears were obviously tears of relief, in a sense, that we now have our 7 men. The thing that we've desired all along in this, we've got 7 men to bring home for burial. The whole community has obviously shared in the grief that has been particular to the families themselves. We've all felt deeply for them in this, and we've all had our own pains too, as we mourn the loss of 7 of our men in our communities. We've drawn strength from one another over the last 3 weeks. We've drawn strength from the wider community, and indeed, as I've already said previously, from the wider world, who have sent us messages of sympathy and support.
I'm standing on the pier. The Scotian shore is now docked as the container bringing the bodies of the 7 dead trawlermen is now being lifted off the Scotian shore. On top of the container is a large Manx flag with the 3 legs emblem, and on either side of that the flag of St Andrew, the flag of Scotland. Deputy Chief Constable Alan Cretney salutes as the container comes to rest on the pier. Shortly the marquee will be brought over the container and then the bodies transferred by hearse to the mortuary.
Dave Moore witnessing the arrival of the bodies of the 7 crewmen of the Solway Harvester in Douglas last night. The specially chartered boat, the Scotian Shore, berthed on the south side of the Victoria Pier at around 9:30. The Home Affairs Minister Alan Bell was also present.
Well, it's obviously a very emotional moment for everyone tonight. It's the culmination of really 3 weeks planning and hard work and commitment by a large number of people. But I think most people now think about the relatives and the sad occasion, certainly, but also the relief, I think, that this whole exercise has brought them now, in the knowledge that all crew members have been found and brought ashore, and the final stages of this whole tragic event can be slowly brought to an end.
The bodies left the pier in a convoy of funeral directors' vehicles and were taken to police headquarters in Douglas, where certain formalities were carried out. Inquests on the 7 dead fishermen are due to open in Douglas this afternoon.
Families of the crew sat quietly listening in court number 3 this afternoon as Coroner Michael Moyle read out one by one the names of their loved ones, and in each case gave the cause of death by drowning. Following the formalities of the inquest, Mr. Moyle broke with tradition to make a statement on the deaths of the 7 young men. He told the families their pain and suffering was shared by the entire Manx nation, and he said no effort would be spared in trying to find out what caused the vessel to sink. He praised the Isle of Man government for their decision to make funds available to recover the bodies, and he criticised other governments who refused to take the same action, blaming such decisions on financial considerations, which he described as downright shameful.
I understand that on their arrival in West Frew, which should be about 3 o'clock today, the bodies will be taken to a communal hall near Whithorn, and there they're going to remain until the funeral time, and this will afford local people the opportunity to come in and pay their respects, and also to leave any flowers, so that when the funerals take place, they will be on a communal sort of basis.
Today, every place was taken in the parish church and the nearby village hall. Outside, hundreds more crowded round, straining to hear the service relayed on speakers as a stiff breeze came in from the sea. The Reverend Alec Curry led the service.
On the Thursday morning, after the Solway Harvester went down, a television reporter stood on the harbour here in the Isle and said, "To put this tragedy into its context, in the loss of the 3 members of the Mills family, this village has lost 1% of its population. We mourn the passing of 3 of our own. They were not merely statistics. They were husbands, brothers, sons and fathers."
The 7 were home, but it was winter and the raising of the wrecked fishing vessel had to wait until the weather improved.
In the spring, when we can get calm weather predicted for long periods, it is possible to get heavy lifting barges from the Irish Sea area who can do a lift. We've actually left the vessel in a condition with harnesses and ropes, etc., ready for a quick lift when the time comes.
The MV Norma has now begun the journey to Ramsey. Once there, the Solway Harvester will be towed into port and the task of trying to discover why she sank can begin. It ends a lengthy and costly recovery operation which began after the scallop dredger was seemingly overwhelmed by heavy seas in January.
This boat was towed in very slowly, a very calm sea, one of those sort of bright summer, early June evenings, which the air is quite crisp and the colours are quite vivid. And all you could hear was this boat coming in, and it wasn't coming in, as I said, at a speed. It was going sort of pop, 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 pop as it came in quite slowly across the harbour. One thing that struck me at the time, most interesting, was a lot of people turned out to see this boat being towed in. We're talking about serious numbers, thousands round the Ramsey harbour. And the one thing that struck me as I was standing there, and you can hear it when you've got a pair of earphones on, you hear sort of the sounds coming through. There was no sound. They were absolutely quiet. It was amazing how so many people just went, that you could feel the silence, which you normally feel the noise, but this time you could feel the silence. It was quite a remarkable occasion, and I very clearly remember it.
Obviously, after the horror of such a disaster, the next thing is to make sure, if possible, it doesn't happen again. In the report there are safety recommendations, including checking that any life raft carried is in date for servicing and correctly attached. Take emergency action in the promotion of safe practice and its enforcement of safety requirements, including in these areas the watertight integrity of main decks, the service history of life rafts, the correct installation of life rafts, the crew's completion of the mandatory basic safety training courses. Later on in the list of recommendations for safety improvements, consider a research project to investigate whether the trend in modern fishing vessel design towards lower length to breadth ratios is exposing them to an increased risk of capsize in the event of fishroom flooding. The large size of the fishroom, it notes, meant that the relatively low levels of flooding could lead to the vessel capsizing.
I think we want to give the investigation board a duty actually to recover boats, or at least to investigate the feasibility of recovering boats or recovering the bodies which may be on boats in the case of an accident. Hitherto, their policy has been simply to leave the vessel on the seabed. That may have been an acceptable policy 50 years ago, but I think things have moved on. People do want to see their loved ones back. And the technology has changed as well to make it far more feasible for that to happen.
To this day, I don't think we're ever going to be happy that the reasons were given for it going down so quickly. You know, when you think them two young fellas, the 17 and 18-year-old, were still in their bunks with their T-shirts on, you know, so there wasn't even time for anybody to do anything. It just went to the bottom. It was £1 million. We had to bring a huge crane over from the other side of England, but it was well worth it because I think the Isle of Man stood in the world, in fact, to be credible.
Donald Gelling, speaking at a service held at the Memorial Stone on Douglas Head in 2020.
The Lone Piper that was organised 20 years ago when the bodies of the 7 young men was brought to the island. We repeated that here today as a touch to what was I think it was a tragedy in 2000, but I think Donald Gelling and his team, when he was Council of Ministers, did the people of Scotland proud by the way the Isle of Man responded to this tragedy, and I think it was really fitting that he was able to join me here today to be a part of the ceremony.
It's hard for me to believe that it's 20 years ago, to be absolutely honest. The time has flown, and of course I got to know the families, all of the families of those who lost their lives very well, and my mind still sits in that area because they were a great influence, certainly to myself personally and to the council at the time, that they wanted their loved ones back if it was at all possible. Of course, the one that stands out really was Craig, the skipper's brother Robin's wife, of course, who was a nurse, and she had a little girl, and she was in fact 2 months short of delivering, and she said, how can I tell him when he's born that his dad went out in the boat and never came back, whereas if he's up in the cemetery we can go up with flowers and it'll, as you say, bring closure to it.
The years pass, but the memories remain, and also the gratitude of one small fishing community very conscious of its loss and its neighbour across the Irish Sea.
We would recommend that steps be taken now and consideration be given to twinning the communities. As I say, we in this part of the world can never express our gratitude about the way we feel because of the fact that you brought our boys home. So this is a way of saying thank you and making sure that you never forget our gratitude.